Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see you here on such a beautiful fall evening. We hope for many more, but we're glad you chose to be here this evening. Ambassador Enger, honored guests, contributors to the Wallenberg Endowment, and friends of the University of Michigan. And a welcome to a special guest, Bertil Jobius, the press counselor from the Swedish Embassy in Washington, is here with us this evening. My name is Elaine Didier, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Wallenberg Endowment Committee and the Rackham School of Graduate Studies, which oversees the Wallenberg Fund. This is the 6th annual Wallenberg Lecture to be presented here at the University of Michigan. The Wallenberg Endowment was created in 1985 through the intensive energy and effort of individuals committed to recognize and honor the memory and contributions of Raoul Wallenberg. Individuals selected to receive the Wallenberg Medal and present the lecture are noted for their outstanding humanitarianism, heroism, courage, integrity, pursuit of human rights, and resistance to oppression. As noted in your program, previous recipients of the prestigious Wallenberg Award have included Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor, Jan Karski, a courier for the Polish underground resistance, Helen Suzman, a longtime South African legislator and crusader against apartheid. And last year, as you know, we were honored to have 2 Wallenberg lectures. The first by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama of Tibet, and the second by Miep Gies, who helped to shelter Anne Frank and her family from the Nazis in Amsterdam. This evening, we are here to recognize and learn from the example of Per Enger, who helped his lifelong friend Raoul Wallenberg save the lives of thousands of Hungarian Jews in Nazi-occupied Budapest during World War II. Since 1995 marks the 50th anniversary of Wallenberg's disappearance and of the liberation of the Nazi death camps, it is particularly fitting that this year's lecturer is someone who knew Wallenberg well and who worked side by side with him in helping to save many lives. Members of the university community and the Wallenberg Selection Committee are delighted to have you here with us tonight for this special event. Since their inception, it has been a tradition of these lectures to have the Wallenberg Medal presented by the president of the university, Jim Duderstadt. Dr. Duderstadt has been a strong supporter of the lectures and regrets very much that he had to be out of town today. The president, in fact, is directly responsible for our being able to have Ambassador Enger here this evening. This particular lecture was made possible by a loan from the president's office, as the committee's funds were totally depleted by our hosting the 2 international speakers last year, and the annual income from the Wallenberg Endowment would not have been sufficient for us to sponsor a lecture this year. Income from the endowment supports not only these lectures, but also provides a stipend for a graduate student whose research is consistent with the goals of the lectureship, and that student then is designated as a Wallenberg Fellow. This year's fellow is Carolyn Krause, a doctoral student in the combined program in English and Education. Carolyn, would you please stand and be recognized? There she is. Congratulations to you. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Andrew Nagy of the College of Engineering. Professor Nagy was born in Budapest, Hungary. He survived the killings and deportations toward the end of the war in 1942 in a Swedish safe house. A few years later, he immigrated to Australia, where he worked during the day and went to school at night, eventually graduating with a bachelor's degree in engineering. He received a Fulbright Award to come to the United States and arrived in Ann Arbor in 1959 and has been here ever since. He has held numerous academic and administrative positions and presently is a professor of atmospheric and oceanographic space sciences and also of electrical engineering, and has been an active member and contributor to the Wallenberg Endowment and the selection committees. Professor Nagy.
Good evening, Ambassador Enger, Dean Didier, ladies and gentlemen. As Dean Didier said, my name is Andrew Nagy, and I'm one of the many thousands of people who owe their lives to Raoul Wallenberg, one of the most distinguished alumni of this university. For many years, his stay in Ann Arbor was not well known, especially outside the School of Architecture. I'd been on this campus for nearly 20 years before I learned that he was a fellow graduate of the University of Michigan. In the early 1980s, a number of us got together and decided that his alma mater must honor him in some appropriate fashion. We agreed that his story, which is an outstanding example of heroism in the face of evil, needs to be told and retold over and over again. We need to tell new generations that yes, it is possible for a single person to make a difference. Out of these efforts was born the Wallenberg Medal and Lecture Series, which we are here gathered for this evening. Each year, we remember and celebrate Wallenberg's heroism and courage. We do this by retelling the story of Raoul Wallenberg, by recognizing an outstanding humanitarian with the Wallenberg Medal, and finally by listening to the medalist deliver a lecture on a subject of his or her choosing. Ambassador Anger met with us once before, a number of years ago, when this concept was in its infancy. It is more than appropriate that he returns here tonight to receive the Wallenberg Medal. As Dean Didier mentioned, this year is the 50th anniversary of Wallenberg's disappearance into the Soviet Gulag system, and we will hear more about that from Ambassador Anger, who worked with Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest in 1944 during that horrid year of deportations and murder. Now let me very briefly retell the Wallenberg story. Raoul Wallenberg was born in 1912. He was born into one of the most prominent families in Sweden, a family whose members included financiers, bishops, artists, diplomats, bankers, etc. His father died before he was born, and his parental grandfather played an important role in his upbringing. It was this grandfather, Gustav Wallenberg, who strongly encouraged Raoul to attend the University of Michigan, where Raoul spent a few apparently very happy years earning a degree in architecture and graduating with honors in 1935. Upon his return to Sweden, he embarked on a career of commerce and finance. An interesting footnote to history is the fact that in 1937, Raoul wrote to one of his professors here at Michigan and indicated that he might be interested in returning and pursuing a career in architecture. Unfortunately for him, and very fortunately for many of us, that never happened. He spent some time in Palestine in the late 30s, where he first encountered people fleeing from Nazi persecution. A few years later, he became a junior partner in a Swedish trading company, which was owned by a Hungarian Jew, and his resulting travels exposed him further to the horrors going on in German-occupied Europe. Thus, when in 1944, the US War Refugee Board was looking for a volunteer to be sent to Hungary to try to save the last remaining Jewish population under fascist rule, he was an obvious choice, and he did not hesitate to accept such a dangerous and challenging assignment, even though the people threatened were neither his countrymen nor of his religion. During his brief 6-month stay in Budapest, Wallenberg made his mark in history by showing courage and dedication in the face of unimaginable evil. He worked tirelessly, nearly single-handed, with tremendous boldness, defiance, persistence, and imagination. He issued protective passes called Schutzpasses, created so-called safe houses, and tried to be everywhere in person, pulling people out of cattle cars bound for death camps, from lorries heading to Germany, stopping Hungarian fascists set to kill groups of helpless women and children. I did not meet Wallenberg personally, but his activities indirectly saved my life. My mother and I succeeded in obtaining a forged Swiss protective passport. However, it was known that they were nowhere as useful as the Swedish ones, because there was no Wallenberg behind the Swiss papers. Thus, despite the fact that we had Swiss passes, we stayed in a Swedish safe house, and that, in effect, is what saved our lives. Being in a Swedish safe house was not a guarantee for survival, because Wallenberg could not be at all places at all times. A tragic example of this was that the occupants of another Swedish safe house, which were located less than a block from where we lived, were marched down to the Danube on Christmas Day and machine-gunned into the Danube by the Hungarian fascists. As I mentioned to you earlier, this is the 50th anniversary of Raoul Wallenberg's arrest by the Soviet army. We must be sure that he's not forgotten, but stand as a supreme and shining example of human courage and spirit. While just about everybody was silent, trembling in fear, or looking the other way, Wallenberg stood up and relentlessly, without showing any fear, fought evil with courage. When people ask us, what can a single person do to change things around us for the better, we can and should point to the example of Raoul Wallenberg, that no matter how formidable the odds are, one person can make a difference. And now let me turn the podium over to Professor Irene Butter, who's also a Holocaust survivor and who played a very central role in establishing this medal and lecture series. Thank you.
Let me start with a greeting to all of you, friends, colleagues, and Wallenberg constituents. I can hardly tell you how wonderful it is to see a growing number of familiar folks who return each year for this Wallenberg lecture. It is beginning to feel like an annual reunion. Thanks for coming, and continue to come. And a reunion it is also with the Honorable Ambassador Per Unger, who presented a lecture on Raoul Wallenberg in Ann Arbor in 1988, before the endowment which funds the lecture and medal had been established. I am delighted to welcome Ambassador Unger to our reunion today. This time, there are several features of the Wallenberg lecture that are special and noteworthy. And in addition to the ones that have already been mentioned, namely the 50th anniversary of Wallenberg's arrest by the Russian and deportation to the Russian prisons, and also the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, the liberation of the Nazi death camps, and year-long commemoration all over the world to mourn the victims and to celebrate the rescuers and the survivors. Also, since our last Wallenberg lecture a year ago, there is the release of new information from the Russians regarding the whereabouts and the treatment of Wallenberg after his arrest. But most special of all about this year is the fact that for the first time in the history of this Wallenberg lecture, we are honoring an individual who lived at the same time, who worked in the same place to achievement of the same goals as Raoul Wallenberg, to rescue and protect Hungarian Jews destined for deportation. Ambassador Unger had a personal friendship and a lifelong connection, and this connection still continues, as you will hear from him, with Raoul Wallenberg. And we honor him today for the same type of courageous acts, self-sacrifice, and heroic leadership during World War II. In addition to his collaboration with Wallenberg, Ambassador Unger was actively involved for most of his life, first in trying to persuade the Swedish government to negotiate with the Russians for the release of Raoul Wallenberg shortly after World War II, and later in serving on several committees that conducted inquiries on the case of Raoul Wallenberg, and in more recent years, meeting with Russian officials for clarification of what remains the Wallenberg mystery. Now, it is also fortunate to have in our midst a Wallenberg survivor, Professor Andrew Nagy, who experienced the same tumultuous times in Budapest as Raoul Wallenberg and Per Unger, indeed as someone who was rescued, and his presence is a testament to the monumental deeds of Raoul Wallenberg and Per Unger. And isn't it a special feat to have the Wallenberg story told today by a Wallenberg survivor? Thank you, Andy, for being here. And as to my own part, while not a Wallenberg survivor, I am a Holocaust survivor who owes her life in part to a Swede in Stockholm who provided my family with falsified Ecuadorian passports, which qualified us for an exchange out of the German concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in January of 1945, and approximately 3 months before this camp was liberated by the Allies. Therefore, in some sense, the rescue efforts of courageous individuals like Raoul Wallenberg and Per Unger also contributed to my presence here today. Now, the Honorable Ambassador Per Unger was born in Göteborg in Sweden in 1913. After he completed a law degree at the University of Uppsala in 1939, he joined the Swedish Foreign Service. His first post was at the Swedish Embassy in Berlin, and that was followed by his post in Budapest from 1942 to 1945. And this is where he became a close collaborator with Raoul Wallenberg, and also where he met with Wallenberg for the last time just 1 week before his arrest by the Russians in January of 1945. A career diplomat, Ambassador Unger held posts in Cairo, in Addis Ababa, Paris, Vienna, and San Francisco, and during the 70s he was ambassador to Australia and to Canada. He is a decorated commander of the Swedish North Star and president of the Raoul Wallenberg Association of Sweden. Now, in 1981, Ambassador Unger published a fascinating book called With Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest, and it is a book well worth reading. Unfortunately, it is currently out of print, but Ambassador Unger informed me that it will be republished in association with the American Holocaust Memorial Museum, and hopefully this will happen later on this year so that it will be available once again. Another book that I would like to mention and recommend very highly is a book called Letters and Dispatches by Raoul Wallenberg, which this year was translated into English and published in this country for the first time. It will be particularly interesting to some of the members in this audience because it contains many letters that were written right here in Ann Arbor when he was studying architecture between 1931 and 1935. And you will find familiarity with some of these letters. Now, as an epilogue to his book, which Ambassador Unger added in 1985, he said the following. He said that we know that Raoul Wallenberg is still alive. We shall never give up the fight for him, a man who through his endeavor for righteousness has become the symbol of the fight for human rights, for man's freedom and dignity. That was 1985. Ambassador Unger will present new information uncovered since 1985, and also will give us his interpretation of these new perspectives concerning the fate of Raoul Wallenberg. Today, we honor Ambassador Unger with the Raoul Wallenberg Medal, and it is indeed a profound joy and privilege for me to present the Raoul Wallenberg Medal to you.
Well, thank you very much, Irene, and thank you all in the committee for the endowment of this medal, this lecturing here. I'm very moved indeed, and it's always for me a great privilege to come back to Ann Arbor, where my very close friend Raoul Wallenberg was studying in the 30s. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Well, the Raoul Wallenberg saga is very moving. It's very unique. Never has a man succeeded in modern times to save that many people in such a short time as Raoul Wallenberg did. Many books have been written about him and his deeds, and there are films all over the world, documentaries and other films about his deeds. And all the deeds are commemorated in different forms all over the world also. He has been paid tribute to in parliaments by heads of states. There are sculptures in the different cities of the world and so forth. There is no end really today of what all the tributes which have been paid to Raoul Wallenberg. But all this information about him tells us about his deeds, but not very much about Raoul Wallenberg as a person. Who was he? Who is Raoul Wallenberg, really? It's people know very much now, and you here certainly know very much about how he performed his duties and what he did and how many people he saved and all that. But who is he, and what made him leave Sweden, neutral Sweden, out in Europe to risk his life for trying to save the Jewish people in Hungary? Well, the questions are many. I think that one of the answers you get is the new book now, which has just appeared, called Dispatches, Letters and Dispatches. That is which was long ago published in Sweden. There are the letters the exchange of letters between Raoul Wallenberg and his grandfather. As you have heard or read, perhaps Raoul Wallenberg's father died a couple of months before Raoul was born, and so his grandfather took on him to help and to follow his education and give him advice and all that. So that was his grandfather who more or less insisted on Raoul coming out to the United States. As he says in one letter, only if you go there you will develop in your character in the right way and get the idea of the right ideals and all that and so on. And that was in the 30s, so that was rather long ago. Today it's very common that you send your children to the United States for studying and all that. But in the 30s it wasn't that common, but his grandfather had that foresight and he saw this very clearly. And in the letters Raoul wrote, you find very much how his character was formed out here in the United States. These 5 years he spent here in Ann Arbor, and he was traveling all around and so on. And you notice how he very, very soon adopted the American way of life, the American ideals of democracy, freedom, dignity of man, and so on. And it's also interesting to know then, in the perspective, that after having spent his years here, after having graduated here as an architect, he came in 1936 to Haifa. And there he met the first Jewish refugees coming from Germany. And I think with his impressions from here, fresh in mind and all that, and listen to these refugee stories. I'm convinced that he already at that time, in 1936, made up his mind. He said to himself, he was an idealist, he was a warm person, he wanted to help and all that. And that has already been said here by those students who are his classmates. Dr. Sol King, for instance, have made a speech in 1972, which I read once more before I came here. And you say this, that it came as no surprise that Raoul Wallenberg, all his deeds in Budapest and all that, came as no surprise for us here, because having seen him, known his warm human attitudes here and sort of exhibited here in Ann Arbor, it came as no surprise what he did then for humanity later on during the war. And I'm convinced that with these impressions from here, he made up his mind in Haifa and said, I, Raoul Wallenberg, I have to do something to help. And then he came later on to Sweden, and years passed by, and he was working in Stockholm with a Jewish businessman, an Hungarian Jewish businessman. And there again, he got information about what's going on in Europe, and the anti-Semitism in Hungary at that time, which was starting on. And so when it came to the serious situation of the persecutions then in Hungary, he was in a way prepared in his mind for going. It was quite natural for him to take on this job. It was, you can call it a coincidence, but I don't know, I don't believe in that. I think it was meant to be that he was the man who was going to Budapest, because first Count Bernadotte was asked to go with the Swedish Red Cross delegation in 1944 to help. But he was refused by the Germans and the Hungarians. He didn't get permission to enter Hungary, and so the offer came to Raoul to go. And that is the day when he comes to Budapest, and I receive him there in July 1944. Unfortunately, late, but that was how it happened. Hungary was already at that time, had already at that time been cleaned, as the Germans said, by the great evacuation from the countryside had already happened. And it came shortly after the 19th of March 44, when the Germans invaded Hungary to force Hungary to persecute the Jews in a more efficient way than before. And so in no time, in April, May, June, they evacuated, so to say, or deported the whole Jewish population in the countryside of 600,000 people to Auschwitz. But there were remaining 200,000 Jewish people in Budapest. So we concentrated all our efforts to help as much as we could. It was a very Vatican and Portuguese and Spanish embassies in big numbers pleading for help. We really didn't know what to do. But, and we were a small staff of a handful of people at the embassy, so I said to myself, we have to try something. And we got the permission from Sweden to give visa to Sweden to all those Jewish people who had connections with Sweden in one way or another, relatives, business connections, and all that. So we gave them visa, and I sort of invented a kind of a paper saying that this person has got a visa to Sweden until he is able to travel to Sweden, which of course wasn't possible because he couldn't travel through Germany. But till that happens, he is under the protection of the Royal Swedish Embassy. A very illegal document, of course, with stamps on and all that, which impressed the Nazis very much. And, and many of them were illiterate, and they couldn't read, but they could see the stamps. And so we were encouraged, because in that way we managed to save a couple of hundred people, I think about 700-800 people. But the numbers increased the whole time of the applicants, and we couldn't cope with it, so we sent for help. And that is when Raoul Wallenberg comes. He comes then in July to Hungary, to Budapest. And I received him there, and you might have heard the story, but he had quite a sense of humor. So when he comes then traveling with a rucksack and a sleeping bag and a revolver in his hand, I said to himself, my God, this is not an ordinary equipment for a diplomat. Oh, well, he said, you see, and he would, of course, have great use of this equipment, this sleeping bag and this rucksack and all that. But you see, the revolver, I only bring that to give myself courage. And he never used it, of course. So I knew him from Sweden, and I was quite convinced that he was the right man for this job. He was a very clever negotiator. I had seen that before, because he came then already in 1942 and 43 as a businessman to Budapest and negotiated for business between Sweden and Hungary. And I knew that he was a very good organizer, and he was courageous, and what's more, he was an idealist and a very warm person. He was very inventive, so he organized. The first thing he did was, of course, that he looked at my papers and said, of course I was a little disappointed, because, well, okay, they are good, but I could do it better, he said. And then he designed this, what we call Schutzpass, a protective passport, in the Swedish colors, you know, and the Swedish emblems on it, and so on. And we were very excited, both of us. We were sitting there and working on that, and we didn't notice that we put the Swedish crowns upside down. But the Nazi didn't understand that, of course, so we managed just the same with this kind of new passport. And then he negotiated a very clever way, and we managed to get the permission of the Hungarian government at that time. It was not a Nazi government, it was a pro-German government. And I think the Germans were anxious to maintain the kind of image that Hungary was a free country, and they let the Hungarian government act and so on independently and so on. So with the government, then we got the agreement to issue 4,500 passports and have those people, the holder of those passports, lodged in houses, big apartment houses which we bought or Raoul Wallenberg bought or rented with help of the money he got from the United States. Because the United States was behind, there was two bodies behind this. There was the World Jewish Congress and the War Refugee Board in the United States, who financed this action. And with the help of this money, we bought and rented all these houses, you see. Of course, in all secrecy, we were lodging more than 4,500. So when you assess the situation just after the war, you will find that we had about 20,000 people living in those houses. So that was how he acted, and all these actions are very well known, so I am not going to go too much into details about it, but that was one way of acting, the passports and all that. The other thing was that he himself in person acted very actively. He went to railway stations, stopped the trains with people who were going to deport to Auschwitz, and I was with him sometimes, and he always bluffed, you know, and he always ordered the German commandant to open the doors, and there are Swedes here, and there were perhaps only a couple of them there, and he then said, well, I remember you over there, I gave you passports the other day, and don't you have any paper showing that you have got a passport? And they understood, so they showed all the kind of Hungarian documents, driving licenses or receipts or anything in Hungarian language which the Germans didn't understand. And so he said, oh yeah, that's right, I remember you got passport, and you come with me, and he marched away with 100 people like that and so on. That's the way how he acted, and I sometimes tried to copy him and helped him and so on. And then we were together often on the death marches to the Hungarian-Austrian border. That was towards the end of the war when all the railway lines were bombed, and there was the most cruel way of deporting people. People were forced to march in the winter 200 kilometers from Budapest to the Hungarian-Austrian border. Many died on the way and so on. And those who came to the border were taken over by the Eichmann Commando, who then deported them to Auschwitz. We managed to, and Raoul Wallenberg managed to save quite a few there, also with bluff. One story which I never forget is how he always found a solution. He always invented a new way of saving people. And there was standing around 50 young Jewish students waiting for being handed over to the Germans. And Raoul Wallenberg approached them and said, are there anyone here who has a Swedish protective passport? There were only 2. Please come forward. And then he said, but you must have remembered that the Hungarian authorities confiscated all your passports the other day. Don't you remember? Oh, yes, they remembered. All the 50 people came forward. And then we transported them back to our safe houses in Budapest. So that's how he acted, and he managed to, just because he was that person, to save people. You ask the question very often, how on earth could the Germans tolerate all this? I mean, in front of them, we just took away those people from them who they were going to deport to Auschwitz. I think the answer is that Raoul Wallenberg's, first of all, Raoul Wallenberg was also an actor. I forgot to say that. When we spoke to each other, he was that calm, soft-speaking. He looked more like a professor, an intellectual like that, and so on. But when he was confronted with the Germans, he changed his attitude completely and got a very aggressive tone. He yelled at them and used the same language as they did, and he spoke very good German also. And they were impressed. So thanks to his personality. But that wouldn't have helped if he hadn't been a Swedish diplomat. And he had that behind him, and the whole base of our embassy behind him, which the Germans at that time, towards the end of the war, were very, very anxious not to violate these diplomatic relations. They needed the kind of a reading hall up in the north, neutral Sweden, and I'm quite sure also that they might have, from the top, Himmler and those people already then had the thought that perhaps Sweden one day could help us to get a peace treaty with the Allies behind the back of the Soviets. That was a dream which then Himmler tried later on. He tried during that period towards the very end of the war in 1945. He tried that through Count Bernadotte, who was out then to help to evacuate quite a big number of Jewish people from the concentration camps. And then Himmler tried that, but of course it was doomed to fail. But anyhow, I think all these thoughts about Sweden as perhaps some valuable place for the Germans when they saw that they were going to lose the war, perhaps that was the reason why, I understand, the German authorities, military or others in Budapest, had a standing instructions, by all means, don't violate the relationship with Sweden. There was one exception there. Eichmann tried once to kill Raoul Wallenberg. He drove a big truck into Raoul Wallenberg's car. Happily enough, Raoul Wallenberg wasn't in that car at that time. But Raoul Wallenberg got very angry, of course, and we all of, and he telephoned directly to Eichmann and told him in so many words that he didn't like that kind of a trick. But we reported that to Sweden, and our embassy in Berlin were instructed to protest. And there comes this, if I may say so, rather funny answer from Eichmann, who was then reprimanded from the Home Office, that by all means you should never do things like that. And then Eichmann answers and says, well, you see, I couldn't help doing it because Raoul Wallenberg was acting in such an unconventional way. That was said by Eichmann, you know. Anyhow, the last time I saw Raoul Wallenberg was on the 10th of January, 1945, when he came up to me on the Buda side of Budapest. We were underground, we were all hiding because the Nazi had invaded the embassy and all that, and we were all more or less hiding and moving from one place to another. And the same with Raoul Wallenberg, but he was on the Pest side where he had all his offices and so on. And then I said to him, now, you have done everything you can. Please stay on now, hide, because the Nazis are after you, and so on. But he said then to me that I could never ever go back to Sweden without knowing that I have done as much as I can to save as many people as possible. So then he left me on the 10th of January and comes over to Pest, where the Soviets already had started to enter. He contacts them, and then he was arrested by the Soviets. That's in short, I could go into many of the details, but that's in short the story. And then comes, of course, the question, why did the Soviets arrest Raoul Wallenberg? Why didn't they arrest all of us? Well, Raoul Wallenberg happened to be then alone on the Pest side when the troops came. He was the main actor. He was the man who corresponded with the Americans. And the KGB officers who were there, and they had spies already before they came at his offices. They knew that we had contact in Stockholm with the American embassy, where the man there who was the representative of the War Refugee Board was also at the same time the OSS man, the prior to CIA, an agent. We didn't know that, but of course the Soviets knew it. They know about each other's organizations, as you know. So they said to themselves, apparently these KGB people, aha, here is an agent in Stockholm who have sent another agent here to spy on us. Perhaps he's also a double agent because he had contact with Eichmann and all these Germans. And so they reported that to Moscow, and the then Minister of Defense, Bulganin, gave order to arrest Raoul Wallenberg. The interesting thing is that on the 16th of January 1945, they reported, the Foreign Office in Moscow reported to our embassy that we have found Raoul Wallenberg, he is safe, he's under our protection, and here is the list of the Swedes, and the only person we have seen now is Raoul Wallenberg. The others, we don't know where they are. They have disappeared. And the following day, the 17th of January, the order of arrest came. So that must have irritated the KGB very much, that the Foreign Office did inform the Swedes about that they found Raoul Wallenberg. That is a typical example of the lack of communication between a Foreign Office and the Secret Service, so to say. But anyhow, he was brought to Moscow, to the Lubyanka prison, and when I came home, then we came home after having under arrest for a couple of months. On the other side, on the Buddha side, there was another general there. Malinovsky was the general of the Pest side, and he saw all these Swedish flags hanging around, all the people with his passports. So already that made him very irritated and all that. People say that when he came to Pest, his reaction was that I thought I had come to an Hungarian city, but this is apparently a Swedish city here. So all this added to their suspicions, of course, the Russians with their paranoia, as you know. So but they didn't know, but on the other side, our general on our side, he had no communication with this Malinovsky. So that was to our great luck, because otherwise he could have telephoned over the Danube and told him, if you see any Swedes there, arrest them, because they are very suspicious people. But they didn't do that. They just interned us, so we were under guard for a couple of months till they decided to send us home. And when we came home, in Sweden they have thought the whole time that Raoul Wallenberg was safe because they had got that communication. They were more concerned about our fate. But then the reaction then, of course, was very slow in Sweden. That's for sure at the beginning. And when I was asked about Raoul Wallenberg, when I came home in 1945, they said, what do you think? Well, I'm quite convinced that the Soviets have arrested him and brought him to prison, because I knew that they have did the same thing with the Swiss diplomats. And I said, oh, you shouldn't say things about that, about the kind Russians. They are so nice people. They have helped the whole world to win the war against the Nazis. That was not only Sweden, that was in the whole Western world was that kind of attitude, of course. So I was then transferred to another country, and when I came home in 1948, they gave me the file to take over the Raoul Wallenberg file. And then I insisted on now we have to exchange Raoul Wallenberg for some Soviet spy in Sweden. And then that is how the Swedish government at that time refused and said, we don't deal with people like that. So I was quite desperate, and I resigned from that job and got another assignment in the Foreign Office. But ever since that has been in my mind, and that's why since I retired, I've been working for Raoul Wallenberg wholeheartedly. But to return to this, the reason why they arrested him, of course, he comes to Moscow. We got reports then later on, after I had resigned from this job with the Raoul Wallenberg file, reports from Italian diplomats who have been sitting in the same prison as Raoul, communicating with him in 1945, 46, 47. And so we knew that he was there. And finally, later on, in and we never got an answer from the Soviets. The first answer we got was 1947, when they said that we haven't seen anyone called Raoul Wallenberg in our country. That was the first lie, and then they have was lying the whole way through. So that's how finally we got that much evidence that the Swedish Prime Minister went to Moscow in '56, presenting this to the Russian government, and then they had to admit that, oh yes, it was a mistake. He was in prison till 1947, but he died by a heart attack, and that was the version they maintained for a long time. We never believed in that because we got witnesses after that who had seen him in the Vladimir prison in the 50s and so on and so on. And a Swedish doctor Professor Schwarz, went to Moscow in the 60s, met her counterpart there and asked him, and he said, the Russian doctor said, well, Raoul Wallenberg, he's in a mental hospital outside Moscow, and so on. Was denied again by the Soviets, who said that that's not right, and you will be able to speak to that doctor again in our presence. And when we did that, of course, he said that I've never said anything like that. I don't understand German very well. They always spoke German together. So that must be a mistake and all that. So that was the finish of that story. We never came any further than that. But during all these years, then, till about the 50, about say 60, what I say now, 70, 78, it was not very much said about Raoul Wallenberg. It seemed like people had forgotten him, that they believed in this Soviet disinformation that he died and all that. But then, 1969, a new witness came forward saying that he had been with Raoul Wallenberg a couple of years earlier than that. And that caused enormous tension all over the world. And that is how Raoul Wallenberg associations were formed all over, many here in the United States, in Australia and Canada, in Europe, and all those, in Israel, especially on all those places where many of the people who had been saved by him were then living. And so we were working all these years to get him released. Many heads of states, the presidents, different presidents of the United States intervened on our behalf. The German Chancellor Kohl in the recent years, in the parliaments all over the world, they had manifestations for Raoul Wallenberg, and so on and so on. It's been going on the whole time. It never worked during that Soviet period, but it started to work when the perestroika came about, because then they couldn't help to do something. If we hadn't done anything, of course, they wouldn't have done anything then either. But in having this pressure on them, the new regime in the Soviet Union understood that now we have to do something. And so we were invited then in '89, the family and myself, the brother and sister and myself, to go to Moscow for discussions, as they said. And that discussions that started off with they presenting us Raoul Wallenberg's belongings, his passport, his diaries and personal papers and all that and so on. I was very anxious myself to look at his passport, because I remembered that we both had diplomatic passports, and I wasn't quite sure that they hadn't expired, both of them. So I was quite nervous. So the first thing I did, I grabbed Raoul's passport and looked at it, and it was written, prolonged, another 10 years, my name under. So I was happy that it wasn't my fault that the passport, the passport was still valid. So that was not the reason why they had arrested him. And then they said, well, are you not very moved to receive all this? It shows you Raoul Wallenberg is dead. And then we said, no, at all. It's a routine that you take away the belongings from a person when you arrest him. So that's not at all, we don't believe in that at all. And I said to the KGB officer in front of me, this shows you, this must be connected. This, you found it, you said, in a sack in a corner. But this must be connected with kind of a dossier, kind of a file, according to your bureaucracy and your archive system. We know that that couldn't have happened the way you describe it. And then the KGB officer said, I swear that we have no documents whatever, nothing exists here in our archives about Raoul Wallenberg. And then 2 years later, after the failure of the coup in Moscow, all the archives were open and there were hundreds of documents which we received then. Then the Swedish Russian commission had been formed and to study this. And there are in detail reports about our behavior, so to say, how we did it in Budapest, how pro-German we were, how we issued passports to the Germans, to the Nazis, not to the Jews and all that. All this fabricated by the KGB because they wanted to have an alibi towards Molotov and Stalin for having arrested Raoul Wallenberg. That was what we did. Completely false documents. But there were also documents about his whereabouts in Lublanka prison, in Lefortoyas prison, where he was questioned, the dates when he was questioned, and his signature, which every prisoner has to sign, a paper that today he was questioned by that and that person, and so on. And so that's, I'm not a member of that commission, but Raoul's brother, Guy von Dardel, is one of the members, and so on. And of course, I get the reports from them always. They have been working now for a couple of years. They have questioned witnesses, and we know that there are a few retired KGB officers who know the secret. Especially one, Kopilansky is his name. He refuses to speak. He said, I have forgotten everything, you know. And we know that he is the man who knows what happened. Because so far, no real document has been found what happened to Raoul Wallenberg. There are rumors about it, that he was killed, he was executed, and all that. And one, Studoplatov, is a KGB officer who has written his memoirs. He says that, and again, third-hand witnesses and so on. He said, I have heard from someone who heard that, you see, we have a kind of a laboratory for sort of giving injections to people who we want to sort of get rid of. And of course, they did that with many of their own compatriots. And so my belief is, I believe, he said in his memoirs, that that happened to Raoul Wallenberg also. But he hasn't been able to prove it. And there are other similar rumors the whole time, that he was tortured to death, that he was, that he died a natural death, that he was that and that, and so on. So they're all these are very, very vague, all this information. With other words, to conclude this, I think that, that there is a Swedish diplomat in prison. And typical also is, which I've forgotten to mention to you, before the visit of the Swedish Prime Minister, they had some negotiations between themselves where the Foreign Office is asking the KGB, what shall we answer now, the Swedes, about Raoul Wallenberg, the fate of Raoul Wallenberg? Were there any witnesses who saw when we arrested him? Oh yes, said, you have to find another version. And that is how they ordered then the doctor of the prison to write a report saying that the prisoner Wallenberg died this night by a heart attack. That was the version they maintained for all the years. But since the Commission started to work, they never mention any longer this kind of version. That's out. They have understood that they can't maintain that sort of theory any longer. So either they can't find the document. They're trying to do their best, but they can't find it. Or there could still be some sabotage on the other level among the KGB officers that they don't want to go further and look further. We don't know. But the main thing is to make this work more active. And I was privileged the other day, it was in the spring, to go to Germany to the German President Herzog, who called me and said, couldn't you come, and I would like to hear about the fate of Raoul Wallenberg. And I said to him that there's one thing you could help us with, and that to press this question, because time is running out. Raoul Wallenberg is, if he's still alive, is now 83. And you, with your relationship economically and all that, you could have a pressure on the Soviets, on the Russians, to act, speed up their work, because we have the impression that they have sort of slowed down a little bit now, after all these years. So we are asking for their help, and we hope that it might work. I don't know. So the Commission's work is going on, and I think that there's not much time left for their work, really, because if they don't get any result within a couple of months or half a year, whatever I know, they're going to issue a report. Hopefully, that report will give the truth, will say what happened. If not, I'm afraid that this report will end up with a big question mark. And that is the the sad thing, and that we Swedes, not only we Swedes, but I think the whole world has the right to know what happened to a man who, through his deeds in Budapest, has become one of the greatest humanitarians in modern times, and has become a symbol for the fight for human rights. Thank you very much. If I can hear.
Okay, well, I'll help out if you can.
If you have a mic.
The ambassador is willing to take some questions. If you could speak as loudly as you can, and then we'll rephrase if we need to. One on the right here.
Well, you see, we attached a great hope to this. I mentioned to you the last witness, his name was Kaplan, who came forward in 1978. That happened to be a false witness. He had never been, and we knew that, and the Soviets knew that also, and they told us that when on our meeting. So that was no surprise. But we are very happy about that witness. But we are very happy about that witness, the false witness, because that created the whole attention of the world, you see. And it was very funny in the meeting in Moscow when the KGB officer produced a document saying that this man's witness is false. He was never with Raoul Wallenberg. We have questioned him and all that and so on. We knew that. So I said to him, or to the Foreign Office who was sitting nearby, why didn't you tell us? We would have spared all this attention, this work in the world, because why didn't you tell us? And then what has happened was that the KGB had never informed the Foreign Office about this. So that was the last witness which came forward. But a witness which I attached, and we attached great importance to, is, that I told you, the Dr. Schwartz, who met this doctor saying that he is in a mental hospital in 1961, it was. And so I also forgot to tell you that in this commission's work is now very much attention paid to this side of research. So one tried to look into mental hospitals registers and so on in Moscow, in the former Gulag. It's, I would say, a rather hopeless task. And I asked one of these, there's a psychiatrist involved in this, and there was one American lady who was helpful there and was attached to the commission just for that work. And I said, how could you find a person who 1947 says was given another name and brought in to a mental hospital somewhere now, 50 years later? And she said, well, it's very, very difficult, but you don't find his name. Well, you see, there are two things which the Soviets maintain, and that's very interesting. They maintain the year of the birth, when he was born, and the profession. And I was so excited, she said, when one day I looked through a register and I found an architect born 1912. And I said, that must be Raoul Wallenberg. Unfortunately, he was a Russian, not Raoul Wallenberg, she had found. I mean, that's the way of going through, which is take enormous of time and all that. So, to answer your question, we don't have any witness who have come forward later than 61. There have been rumors, very much of that, during all these years, say in the 70s, 80s, that he was detained in a kind of what do you call, Schweigerlager, a kind of a house where they put famous scientists and so on, who were then 100% isolated from the world, and that he was living in one of these houses. There has been rumors about it, but we have not been able to prove that either.
It seems to me such a paradox that the Swedish government would support the work that Raoul Wallenberg did, but would not agree to exchange a German or a Russian prisoner for him. I don't understand why the Swedish government would support the work that Wallenberg did, but not agree to an exchange in order to save his life.
This is again politics, you know. And to tell you about the situation, of course, Sweden was neutral. Sweden was very anxious. Sweden was in the first years under pressure from Germany. We risked every day to be invaded by the Germans and all that. Later on, Sweden was very anxious to show that we were not neutral at all. We were helping the Allies. They were very happy that we did our work in Budapest and so on. But then comes the new sort of situation when the Swedish government discovers that after the war, Soviet Union will be the dominant power in the Baltic will dominate that whole part of the world. And then comes this old sort of, I would say, fear, whatever you call it, since Charles XII's time when we lost everything 1708 at Poltava. And there had been a kind of a fear for this enormous, this big neighbor who always wanted to come out to the sea. And then at that time they took the part of Sweden along the Baltic, and we are now neighbors. We were neighbors to this big power. So it's kind of a, which I don't agree at all with all this, but it's kind of a realpolitik which the Social Democrats at that time, the government at that time, just after the war, maintained. And they said we should never do anything which would irritate the Soviets. We should try to be on peaceful terms with the Soviets. And that has gone through our politics for a long time, that what can a small country like Sweden do in relationship with a big power. That was immediately after the war. That explains how careful they handled all questions vis-à-vis the Soviets, you see.
Many people must have helped you in Budapest and knew what you were doing. How is it that the Germans didn't uncover your scheme?
That didn't.
Question is, many people must have helped you in Budapest. How is it that the Germans didn't uncover your scheme? Officially.
Who do you mean? Who helped us? Who helped us?
Good question.
Many people were housing the Jews. So many people, there had to be many people in Budapest who were helping you protect the people.
The people who ran the safe houses
No.
were helping.
No, nobody helped us. We helped ourselves. There was only we. We were, I don't know we were cooperating with the Swiss people and all that. But there was certainly, as I were no help from any others in our work. We did it on our own the whole time.
One more? Over there, okay. Yes.
Two things. I've heard that Wallenberg would lie on top of a train sometimes and pass passports through the windows. Is that true, and do you have other stories like that? And the other thing is, President Clinton is getting along very well with Yeltsin now of Russia. Should we be pressing Clinton to ask Yeltsin for help now?
Did you catch that?
Oh, yes.
Okay, good.
Well, the last question, definitely yes. We have always asked for help, and the American, Swedish, the Raoul Wallenberg associations have always tried to approach the president in these questions. So the more help we can get through that channel, the better. I mean, I think this would be an excellent idea, as I see it, to have support from your president. As I said, when I spoke to the German president, this is the same question again, that we are short of time now. We have to act very quickly, because you can't live forever. And Raoul Wallenberg, if he lives, he's rather getting old. And so I'm all for your support here to approach your government, your president, for helping us in this situation. Absolutely. Concerning Raoul Wallenberg's different actions, of course, much of that has been shown in films, especially in the I think I think it was in the Richard Chamberlain film, very much of that also. Part of it is true, part of it is sort of built up during the years, and I don't think that episode happened ever, that he was on the top of a train and sort of distributing passports. I don't think so. But what happened was certainly that the last weeks in Budapest, he didn't care, and we didn't care at all if we gave a passport to a Jew who had no connection with Sweden. So I think that the distribution was more free towards the end of the war than at the beginning, where we were very anxious to follow these rules, because that was one of our best weapons against the Germans, to show them an enormous bureaucracy. We had, Raoul Wallenberg had about, I don't know how many offices, all was sitting scrutinizing the passports and saying, what kind of relationship does he have? He has a cousin in Sweden, and so on and so on and so on. And we were able to show that you are acting according to certain criteria, you see. That was the first part of this action. But towards the end, there was no limit for distributing our passports to the Jewish people.
Okay, Professor Lauder.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Well, the latest release of information that I'm aware of in this country is the epilogue that Kati Martin added to her book, which was also published in the Washington Post under the title called The Liquidation of Raoul Wallenberg. And pretty much the bottom line in that epilogue is that he was executed by the Soviets, and it's based on some diaries of Suda Platov, the spy master, and I think some other documents. And I would appreciate if you could comment on that information.
Thank you. Well, Suda Platov has written his memoirs, and as I said, he refers the whole time to third-hand witnesses and so on. But what he says about this liquidation is a document which we have seen ourselves, which is there, and that is a letter from Wyszynski, who was the deputy foreign minister at that time, to his boss, to Molotov, explaining the situation that we have this Swedish diplomat here and so on. And I suggest, Wyszynski says to Molotov, that you order Abakumov was the head of security, that you order Abakumov to liquidate the case. Liquidation was then interpreted by many people and in Russia as being meant liquidate also the person, kill him. We have another version, and that is many other specialists on the Soviet or Russian sort of philosophy say that liquidation could mean in this case only destroy everything, destroy all the files and records about Raoul Wallenberg. But that doesn't include to kill him. So that confirms us in our version that we believe in, that they destroyed. You haven't found any documents about what happened to him. They had been destroyed. And that then they let him disappear under another name. I think the way the Soviets, the Russians acted during the war is very typical for a situation like that. I've seen camps with people under guard of the Soviets, people whom they didn't know. They thought they were suspect, they were criminals or not criminals, and didn't know. But the commandant never ever dared to let anybody free, or he didn't dare to kill anyone, because in either case he could be wrong, and so and then he would be punished. So it's much better to keep the people. The time will pass and they will be there, and time will solve this situation later on, and so on and so on. So I think in the case of Raoul Wallenberg, they may have thought the same thing, that this Swedish diplomat, perhaps he could be of value for us later on, we don't know. But to go to that drastic action to kill him, I don't think that that came into their mind. I think that they said, well, let him, he belongs to a very famous family in Sweden and all that, we're thinking of business in the future and whatever they were thinking of and so on. Why don't we let time pass and so on? Today, it would be very embarrassing to admit that we have a Swedish diplomat in prison. So let's just hide him somewhere and see what time will tell us later. I think that's what I believe in.
Ambassador Enger, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Before adjourning our program, if you'd stand by for just a couple of moments, I'd like to invite you to 3 more events where you will have the opportunity to meet Ambassador Enger. And the first of those is tonight, right after the program. There is a reception on the 4th floor of Rackham in Assembly Hall. This is hosted by the Wallenberg Selection and Endowment Committees, and you are all cordially invited to come, have some refreshments, and to meet Ambassador Enger. The second is a coffee hour tomorrow morning, on Thursday morning from 10 to 11 here at Rackham in the East Conference Room on the 4th floor. That's just an informal chance to talk with him. And the third is tomorrow afternoon. There will be the dedication of a new work of sculpture by Professor John Rush, who was the designer of the Wallenberg Medal we have presented this evening. Per Enger will be speaking at the dedication of the sculpture, which is in memory of Raoul Wallenberg and in honor of Saul King, who was a classmate of Wallenberg's and was instrumental in creating the Wallenberg Endowment within the College of Architecture and Urban Planning. That event will be hosted by Dean Robert Beckley of the School of Architecture, who's here with us tonight. That is tomorrow at 4 o'clock in front of the College of Architecture on North Campus, and will be followed by tea in the Slusser Gallery. Finally, I'd call your attention to forms that will be in the lobby. If you wish to order a tape of the Miep Hees lecture from last fall, or a copy of tonight's lecture, you can do it using that form. You can also use the form if you wish to make a donation to the endowment to help us in our efforts to keep the memory of Raoul Wallenberg alive through the continuing recognition of individuals such as Per Enger, from whom we've heard tonight. Thank you to our signer for helping us this evening. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you upstairs. Good night.
Nobody was asleep, so I think.
Nobody was asleep.
No, and you see, you provide.